Okay, we're ready to begin now. Hi. I hope everyone can hear me all right. So, hello and a warm welcome to every one of you who has joined us today on the virtual launch of the Health Misinformation Report. Thank you for spending your Thursday with us. I'm Parvati Mohan, the audiovisual lead at Factly. Audiovisual production lead, I'm sorry. So, do stay for the launch, the keynote address, and for what promises to be an insightful panel discussion where we will hear from 3 experts on the problem of health misinformation and how the media and the public should engage with it. The Health Misinformation Report is the result of the year-long Factly Meta Health Fellowship that was instituted last year. I will now pass the buck to Ms. Nandita Kalidas, the first fellow to have been accepted into the program and the author of the report, to introduce it to all of you. Over to you, Nandita.
Thank you, Parvati. Good evening, distinguished guests and all the participants. So glad you could all join us this evening. So as part of the Global Health Fellowship in partnership with Meta, we at Factly have worked on the Health Misinformation Report that covers misinformation, myths, misconceptions, superstitions, taboos across 10 prioritized health sectors. These sectors include immunization, nutrition, menstrual health, maternal health, sexual reproductive health, cancer, COVID-19, public health concerns, non-communicable diseases, and last but not the least, mental health. The creation of the Health Misinformation Report was made possible through the Global Health Fellowship funded by the Meta. The Health Misinformation Report has been authored in the hope to become a seed or a starting point in understanding and combating health misinformation in India. The idea was to go beyond COVID-19 misinformation and separate the substance from the sham. In this regard, we wanted to provide a fundamental understanding of the core subject in each of the prioritized sectors and through secondary research, identify and map the existing misinformation in the particular focus areas. These secondary research, coupled with the interviews of the relevant sectoral experts along with the organizations, have been invaluable in triangulating and validating our research so far. The overarching understanding of the Health Misinformation Report is that misinformation is not a homogeneous entity, but in fact, it manifests over time, generations, geographies, and communities. Therefore, there exists no one-size-fits-all approach, but instead, each of the problem statements require a tailor-made solution. The complexity of the problem is further compounded by the fact that medical misinformation is particularly layered. By that, I mean to say that the myths and the misconceptions in the particular health focus areas are often couched in ambiguous medical terms and traditional practices. For instance, bad menstrual practices continue to be followed till date owing to the stigma and the lack of awareness of a natural physiological process. Therefore, to begin with, it is pertinent to understand the root cause of the problem of misinformation. And the entire research points towards education and awareness being the antidote to misinformation. As an extension of the report, we have also translated the learnings of the report into our in-house full-time health misinformation podcast known as the Unviral. For those of you who prefer the audio medium, we have released about 9 or 11 episodes that are available across all popular podcasting platforms such as Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, among other avenues. We are now glad to inform you all that we are set for the launch of the Health Misinformation Report. Thank you, Parvati. Thank you, and over to you, Parvati.
Thank you, Nandita. We shall now proceed to the launch of the Health Misinformation Report. I request all our guests to please hold up their respective copies of the report for the launch ceremony. Right. Thank you so much, everyone. The information report is now officially launched. The full report is online. We will be posting the URL in the chat box in a few moments. We also have in the audience a few of the wonderful contributors to the report and podcast, like Dr. Subba Rao. And we thank you all so much for your immense contributions to the report and for supporting us again by joining us today. I'd now like to invite Mr. Tushar Barot to make the opening remarks for the launch. Mr. Barot is the Strategic Partner Development Lead for Integrity News Initiatives and Programs. As part of this role, he manages Meta's third-party fact-checking partnerships in India. He has been at Meta for nearly 3 years and has over 20 years' experience as a journalist and digital strategy lead. Yours, Mr. Barot.
Thank you so much, Parvati, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today at the launch of such an important report. So as Parvati mentioned, my role is helping to manage a lot of the work that Meta does in India as part of its global third-party fact-checking program, and as well as other initiatives and programs that we fund. I know some of you may have some awareness of what the fact-checking program is that we help support, but just for those of you who are less familiar, just to give you a quick overview, the fact-checking program has been running for over 4 years now, and we currently partner with 80 fact-checking organizations around the world. And in India, we partner with 10 fact-checking organizations, including Factly, who are the hosts today, as well as Sudipta's organization, who's one of the panelists today, the Healthy Indian Project. And they do fact-checking in 11 Indian languages, in addition to English, across platforms that Meta has. So that can include Facebook and Instagram, but also WhatsApp through WhatsApp tip lines. So one of the things that we had been thinking about over the last year was, with the rise of the pandemic crisis around the world, and particularly the impact it had in India earlier this year, what more could we do to help support fact-checking organizations to really focus on really critical fact-checking of misinformation around health, and in the last few months, particularly around COVID-19 and related issues around it. So one of the ideas that we had, which we launched, and it was very much a sort of a global pilot, was funding a series of global health fellows. It ended up being a group of a dozen fact-checking organizations that applied and were successful, of which Factly was one. And so it was great seeing Nandita over the last year as one of the global health fellows, really taking this subject in real depth, and I think with the support of the Factly team has contributed so much to the sort of dissemination of truthful and accurate information at a time of great confusion. And so one of the things that we did with our health fellows was that we provided them with training from external experts who taught them how to use fact-checking tools and techniques. We also connected them with health professionals and global health agencies from around the world, and including in India, where we were able to build collaborations to rapidly check and verify and confirm misinformation and fact checks around that. So it's in that context that I think the work has been so significant, and part of the output of this work has been this amazing report that's been published today. And as you heard from Nandita, there's some really critical areas in terms of topics that were covered here. So with that, I wanted to just really conclude in saying, again, it's been a great pleasure working with Factly and Nandita over the past year, and I think they've done fantastic work. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from the great panel that we have here, and also, of course, from Professor Gagandeep Kang. So with that, Parvati, I'll hand over back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Barot. It now gives me great pleasure to announce the keynote at this event. Professor Gagandeep Kang is a physician scientist working on vaccines and public health, particularly focused on children and enteric infectious disease in India. She is an elected fellow of the All Indian Science Academies, is the first Indian woman to be elected to the fellowship of the American Academy of Microbiology and to the Royal Society, and the only physician scientist to receive the Infosys Award in Life Sciences. Welcome, Professor Kang. I'm certain that the audience is waiting to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Parvati, for the introduction, and to faculty for the invitation to come and speak with you. I've had the opportunity to interact with Nandita and with several others over the past year, and I hope that this is an engagement that continues. So my own experience with dealing with misinformation and disinformation started with the field that I work in, vaccines. And I thought that, the idea of preventing disease in children was something that everybody would be in favor of. So you don't want your children to get sick. You want to protect them as much as possible. You want to make sure that they stay healthy. And yet, when I started to work on vaccines, I found that there were a lot of people who deliberately attacked us. And this, I discovered, was a 6-step formula that applied to all vaccines. And it goes like this. The first thing is, there is no disease. This organism that we got a vaccine against does not really cause any disease. So if you generate the data to show that this organism does cause disease, and I'm looking here at the one that I worked with most often, which was rotavirus. Children with diarrhea develop rotavirus. Children with diarrhea most often have rotavirus. It can cause dehydrating gastroenteritis. So first they said, well, there's no rotavirus in India. So then we went to look, we found the rotavirus. We said, see, here's rotavirus. Then the thing is, well, children in India don't really get sick with rotavirus very much because they see rotavirus all the time, so it doesn't make them very sick. So now we went from the community to the hospital. We showed that there was a lot of dehydrating gastroenteritis in hospital that was associated with rotavirus. So then the next step is, if it causes disease and the disease is severe, there is an alternate mechanism to treat that severe disease. So here it was, well, children can be treated with rehydration. They don't really die of this infection, so you really shouldn't be giving them a vaccine. When you go ahead and show that there is dehydrating gastroenteritis and that, because children vomit, you can't always rehydrate them. Therefore, you're still making the argument for prevention by vaccination. The next step is, well, children might have the disease might be severe, rehydration might not be sufficient to do it, but the vaccine doesn't work. See, there are vaccines that are used in different parts of the world. This is an oral vaccine. Oral vaccines don't work in developing countries. So then you do a study and you show that the vaccine actually works. Then it becomes, but the vaccine is dangerous. Rotavirus is associated with intussusception. More children will die because they develop intussusception than you'll save because you have diarrhea. So then you prove that risk-benefit is in favor of the vaccine. Then it becomes, well, the vaccine's too expensive. We can't afford to vaccinate our entire country with it. Then you make the cheap vaccine, the cheapest vaccine in the world. You bring it to your children. Then it becomes, well, you're a conspiracy theorist. You've been bought by the Gates Foundation. You've been bought by multinational companies. So therefore, anything you say, we can't believe. So when you show that you're making the cheapest vaccine in the world, that you don't make any money from the Gates Foundation, and you're working with Indian companies, then it becomes, well, let's go right back to the beginning because things have changed since you started out. Now we no longer need the vaccine. So whatever arguments you bring, they have a formula to address it. And this is not new. Over the last 100 years, the approaches that have been taken by people that systematically argue against health information, that are proponents of disinformation has been very similar. It has been science denial. It has been the fact that we will bring fake experts that will give you an opposing point of view so that you have to then dissect out which is true and which is not. You attack the messenger. You go after individuals. You take a systemic problem and you individualize that. You do pretend organizations that are grassroots organizations that are revolting against big industry. These are all patterns that we have seen before, and the kind of work that Factly is doing, that many other organizations like Factly are doing, is absolutely critical to what needs to be done, because we need to recognize that the people that are most vulnerable to misinformation, the people that don't have access to credible sources, that don't have the ability to distinguish fact from fiction, are the most vulnerable in our society. This has been true for the past 100 years, but it has only been amplified by the availability of the kinds of social media that we have access to at different levels of our society. So I really appreciate the work that Factly has done, not just for COVID-19, but across the spectrum, from menstrual health to immunization to looking at cancer. This is something that is critical for our society, and more power to you. I hope that this is something that you will continue, and we are here to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kang. As someone who runs the YouTube channel here, a lot of what you said rings very true about how people react to misinformation and authentic information. So thank you so much. We'll keep the momentum going now by starting the panel discussion. A quick word of introduction on our panelists. Dr. Jayalakshmi Sridhar is a medical doctor and an award-winning health journalist whose area of interest is public health journalism, with a focus on human rights and health governance. She is a WHO consultant and a member of the Internews Health team. Dr. Jayalakshmi is also adjunct professor health journalism at the Asian College of Journalism, Chennai, and a former special correspondent health for Frontline magazine at the Hindu. Mr. Sudipto Sengupta is the founder and CEO of the Healthy Indian Project. A digital product person by heart, he headed the digital division of BW Business World in his earlier stint. Dr. Vinay Deshmane is a surgical oncologist and a specialist in breast cancer. He is the medical director of the Indian Cancer Society and the editor of the Indian Journal of Cancer. He is amongst the first to have developed a specialized breast cancer treatment center in the country. He has pioneered the development of breast endoscopy and oncoplastic breast surgery in the country. He is associated with the Breach Candy Hospital Trust, PD Hinduja Hospital, and the Asian Cancer Institute, and has an experience of over 30 years in this field. A warm welcome to Dr. Jayalakshmi Sridhar, Mr. Sudipto Sengupta, and Dr. Vinay Deshmane. The discussion will be moderated by Ms. Nandita Kalidas. Before I hand it over to her, a quick note to our audience. Please leave your questions for the panelists in the chat section. A member of our team will select a few questions that we will pose to our panelists after the discussion when we have a dedicated Q&A session with the panelists. So with that, over to you, Nandita.
Thanks again, Parvati. So today we have an amazing panel with us to discuss an important topic: media, medicine, and misinformation, identifying and combating health misinformation in India. The discussion aims to address and increase awareness about medical misinformation in the Indian context and discuss some of the potential solutions. So here's the format for the panel discussion. We'll kick off the conversation by asking some of the pertinent questions to each of our panelists, and then we'll open the floor towards the end for a Q&A moderation from the audience. Sounds good. So let's start with our first question to Dr. Jayalakshmi Sridhar. Ma'am, given that you are a medical doctor and that you teach as one of the most prominent journalism schools in the country, my question to you is that in the context of transforming communication landscape in the digital era, where misinformation is gaining prominence, how is reporting taught in the journalism schools, and is fact-checking given enough prominence in the journalism school syllabi in India?
Thanks, Nandita, and first off, congratulations on a excellent start with combating medical misinformation in the form of that report. And thanks also to Dr. Gagandeep Kang for those very pertinent remarks. I'm happy to be part of this discussion today. And as to your question on whether journalism schools are addressing the information, this emerging problem of misinformation, of course they are. More than anything, the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown up, this parallel misinfodemic. It's a syndemic, right, of excessive overload of a lot of science and medical information to audiences that are ill-prepared to absorb it, interpret it, and make sense of it or relate it to their own lives, together with a lot of mis and disinformation that comes from special interest groups of various kinds. Well-meaning people are spreading misinformation and disinformation simply because they lack the tools to sort of tell fact from fiction. So the role of journalism schools is becoming increasingly important to sort of deal with the volume of the challenge, so to speak. As you know, truth-telling has always been, the soul of journalism, and fact-checking and verifying the truth is part of the classic toolbox of how a journalist is trained, and that's the reputation on which journalism is built on those reputations. So with the advent of digital misinformation on the scale that we're seeing it today, these tools have evolved to keep pace. So if you look at institutions like the Asian College of Journalism and many other journalism schools, not just in India but around the world, they're trying to sort of catch up with all of this misinformation by training people with advanced digital technological tools to sort of try and understand where the truth lies. So you're looking at, the methodologies developed by Alt News, for instance, that's being taught, together with how do you, identify, verify doctored imagery, doctored videos, how do you use open source information technology, information intelligence like OSINT, how do you use time-coded satellite imagery, for instance. You can look at a patch of land to see whether it was deforested a few weeks before an Ebola outbreak, for instance. You can use a lot of this wonderful digital technology to sort of do your fact checking. So there's a lot of attention being paid to it in journalism schools, but I'd just like to end by adding one of the important things that we are facing as a huge challenge, and that is persuasion, the power of persuasion by a huge number of people. You're seeing a lot of cultural beliefs, conspiracy theories, political propagandists floating their own very slick, sciencey sounding, highly persuasive narratives on the internet. And the genius of conspiracy theories, as someone once said, is that they can't be proved wrong, right? So I think the role of the health journalist is becoming increasingly challenged. I mean, we're being called upon to reach for several new skills and sharpen our own critical thinking and our approaches to dealing with the epidemic information that we're seeing.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. My next question on the topic of fact-checking is for Mr. Sudipto. Since you deal with misinformation directly, so something, say, unlike misinformation or disinformation that instantly goes viral, verified or fact-checked information does not go as viral. So how do you ensure the extensive dissemination of your content at the Healthy Indian Project?
Well, Nandita, to start with, thanks for having me here today. I'm probably the only non-medical person in the panel. So a little scared about speaking along with my eminent other panelists. However, coming back to your question, how do we disseminate the right information to the people? So there are a couple of measures that we take. To start with, if we see an overlap of the misinformation along with the fact check, by this I mean if the misinformation is getting generated on the social media itself, then obviously we go around and push our fact checks on the social media again. And we do also spend some money to kind of target the right audience by looking at who will be more affected by that particular misinformation. And then there are daily newsletters. We have a quarterly print issue where we constantly push. We have syndication agreements with a couple of media houses and content aggregation platform. Apart from that, there's a few other things that we do is we work with a few community radio stations. I understand Facti also works with a few community radio stations to reach out to the rural audience who we believe gets affected by misinformation even more than the urban audience. Also, a few of the misinformation that we fact check have not been there on the social media. So I'll give you a few typical examples that we have worked on. Late night tele-shopping shows. I mean, I'm not sure how many of the audience actually watch late night tele-shopping shows, but we have found a number of misinformation being peddled on those shows. You know, they sell a herbal oil that you rub on your body and is supposed to emit smoke and burn your fat in 10 minutes. That particular misinformation fact check article was done probably a year ago when we first started working, is still the top 5 articles of our website month on month even today. The reason being, they have no social media presence. People do not know anything about them. They see it on the television, and then they try to find more information and land on our page. I pray that we manage to dissuade some of those audiences from buying those kind of unscientific oils and other things. So once again, coming back to your question, yes, we do follow the traditional routes of social media, newsletter, pushing it through other traditional medias like syndication, etc. But then we also play a lot on the SEO on the particular fact checks that we pick up from the non-social media domains.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Sudipto. You are a very important stakeholder of this panel because you represent the fact-checking community, and we have the doctors and the media professional here. So that is how we wanted to balance the panel here.
Thank you.
On that note, my next question is for both Mr. Sudipto and Dr. Deshmani. While myths and superstitions are one part of the misinformation problem where people can be educated, for instance, say bad menstrual practices, the menstrual myths can be debunked and people can be educated on that front. But say intricate subjects like cancer require more scientific understanding. So how do you explain this complex medical terminology or processes and debunk the causal relationship to cancer? We'll start with Mr. Sudipto.
Okay. So Nandita, I have a little different view out here. I'll tell you what. When we approach a particular health misinformation, I don't think it's right to kind of segment it into two areas where something is more scientific, something is less scientific. Let's understand the fact that something misinformation related to dermatology or gynecology is as important to the misinformation related to oncology. Now, having said that, I understand a few misinformations are peddled with scientific terms thrown in. However, if we go into the core of it from whatever work we have done and we have analyzed, is the basic questions around them always remain same. Why it happens, how it can be cured, whether the treatment is safe. And if we manage to answer that, if we manage to educate people on those terms, then I believe a lot of problem is taken cared of. Be it in any domain, I mean, be it a cancer-related thing or be it a skin-related thing. Now, I'll give you an example. For example, lung cancer. We all have probably seen the various advertisement that runs before in a movie channel before the movie starts, right? The sponge ad where they squeeze a sponge, tar comes out, they tell you how it affects your lungs, smoking affects your lungs. It is not a coincidence, at least I would like to believe, that today the misinformation related to breast cancer is much more than the misinformation related to lung cancer. There had been a constant effort of pushing public messaging about lung cancer, and there is certain amount of awareness that's been generated around it. However, we haven't been able to do the same with all domains of cancer or all domains of health per se. So if we take up the public messaging well, if we take up the duty of creating awareness about a particular health condition well in simple terms, and it can be delivered in simple terms, then I guess the problem of scientific terms scaring away people won't be there.
Right. Over to you, Dr. Deshmani.
Yeah, thank you, Nandita, for having me on this very, very interesting and pertinent and I think very timely program. And I think people like Sudipta are extremely important because a lot of these answers that we may discuss today or conclusions we come to will actually only bear fruit if media actually can handle these in a very sensible and sensitive manner. And the most important thing to realize is that all of us grow up with these sort of beliefs. They're common across this country. And as we know, we are a very huge heterogeneous population of people. Different educational levels, cultural beliefs. So I think the first thing is one should never be confrontational with this. I have found that when patients come to us as doctors, they're receptive. Media problems are slightly different because you're speaking to people who are receptive and non-receptive. We do have to come across beliefs. For example, in cancer, a very common thing is for diagnosis, we do something called a fine needle aspiration or a needle biopsy. A common concept today is that it spreads disease and patients die faster. Okay. But science, yes, there is scientific technology and there is scientific terminology which we use. But as Sudipta said, in the basics of cancer is very simple. It's a cell which grows and spreads. It's as easy as that. So when you actually have a lot of technical knowledge, you can split and bring down these processes to basic understanding, which the person across you can understand. And you need to explain it even in a language that they can understand. And there is no single way. Each situation is different. And if you can actually speak in the same language, for example, in Hindi or in Mumbai, you sometimes have to speak a little bit of Gujarati. It's got to be broken, it doesn't matter. But you tend to get across to your patients and their relatives. And I think this is not going to be an easy solution. It's ongoing all the time. There are new things come up. And we have to deal with the WhatsApp doctor, as we call them, all the time. So it's a matter of getting used to it and accepting it. In fact, very often I ask my patients to go back, read up and come back, and then ask me anything and everything so that when somebody else gives them misinformation, it's easy for them to tackle it because they are aware.
Right, absolutely. A very interesting point that you mentioned is about the WhatsApp doctors. So my question to you is that the digital media, especially during COVID-19 or otherwise, has also seen the rise of misinformation, going from the so-called doctors who claim to be the quote-unquote experts in the fields of especially say diabetes or cancer or any of the lifelong diseases, right? So how do you think this issue must be dealt with?
Well, I think it's the same way. I think media itself has a huge role to play, and that's basically education. I mean, we have to have positive education about all these diseases. And you're quite right, it only happens with the chronic diseases because there is really no cure for chronic diseases. And our human nature is we want to have a solution. We want to have a pill for everything. And with the more and more of digital media, and if you see the younger population, nobody wants to work things out slowly. It's all a quick solution for every single thing. And that's where this comes from. But education is a long-term goal. And I think it's going to be a slow march. And at a personal level, you do tackle things. But even, for example, I'm in a group where a wrong WhatsApp message comes up. If it's very drastically wrong, then I may put in something. But if there is something which is just marginal, and as Sudipta said, everything is not just black and white or this thing. Some of them are, have some things which are okay. I think as long as it's not terribly detrimental, one doesn't start a fight on WhatsApp. That's what really happens in groups, if you notice sometimes. I think you have to handle it very sensitively. And each case, treat each situation on its merit.
Right, absolutely. Thank you for that insightful comment, Dr. Deshmani. Circling back to Dr. Jaya Sridharan, I have a specific media literacy question for you. So in the current media ecosystem with shorter spans and cognitive biases, reporters tend to file faster and crisper stories in limited time. So how should media literacy be taught in the digital era, and at what age must this start in order to inculcate critical thinking and also to learn to sift through verified content, both for journalists as well as people who are anyone who consumes news for that matter?
Yeah, actually, critical thinking and media literacy skills need to come in right from school. I think from a very early age. I think we often talk down to children, and we tend to underestimate what they're able to absorb and understand and interpret for themselves from the environment. I think, if I may add, that in the school atmosphere and at home or in the communes that children live, the conversations that happen around science and health need to be informed ones. And the way the media is consumed when children watch television with their parents, it's ideal that the parents educate them about how to understand the news. And it can be done in a fun and entertaining way, asking questions. What is their opinion when they hear a bit of scientific news or medical information on television, and how do they understand it? And if the parents don't know, they can educate the child about where to go to verify, looking at the source of the information. Who is the person giving you that piece of information? There are simple ways in which this can be done. And this needs to be done on a large scale, not just in our country, but in countries around the world, I think, because misinformation is here to stay. As long as people have a channel and a medium in which to express themselves, they are going to express their opinions, their convictions, whether they are good for public health or not. So we have to come up with ways to sort of understand and interpret it better and deal with it in a democratic and respectful fashion. So I think critical thinking, media literacy skills need to become part of the culture. Children need to be taught to question. They need to be taught how to judge and evaluate what they're hearing. And I think that that's something that will serve them not just in the way they understand and relate to the news. It's also going to help them as a general life skill. I could do with some of that training for one. The other, I'll stop here. I really want to listen to what the other panelists have to say about this as well.
Sure, the floor is open. One of you can take this question. It's a very important question up for discussion.
I think it's much more media-based, and I really liked Dr. Jaya's comments. And I just feel that there is, as I said it again, there is no real clear single way that one can, at a very low level, it's the people that you're in touch with, you can discuss rational thought, and that might come across well. When a doctor-patient relationship, again, we have somebody who's willing to listen, so it's easy. And I think every patient makes a difference, because they will go out and talk to another 50 in the community at some point or the other. Or during their lifetime, they come across and they meet others who are in the similar situation. So if you do educate even a few patients, it seems to has an exponential effect in the community. And I think we all have to work this way. The media will obviously work in a different way because they have a massive reach. And I mean, a project like what you have done itself has brought so much out. That's even made me aware of this whole situation so much more than I was. So I think it's going to be projects like this which will increase awareness in the community. And as once you never realize, the ripple spreads very fast.
Absolutely. Mr. Sudipta, do you have anything to add?
Well, Nandita, there are two aspects to it the way I see. One is a part of media literacy, the other is a part of health literacy. In the part of media literacy, I'll come to the media literacy later. Let me talk about the health literacy that Dr. Deshmane had been constantly emphasizing on, and I believe, I'm a big believer of that. The patients today, or even the general public today, are inquisitive because they have Google at their reach, which is a good thing as well as a bad thing, right? So that if we manage to give them the verified information, if we manage to give them the right information in a very structured way, the patient-doctor interaction becomes much more productive. So there lies a very big responsibility of media platforms to kind of create a bulk of verified health information. Unfortunately, India doesn't have something like WebMD or Mayo Clinic. So we still refer to the Western websites, and sometimes that's a good thing. Many times it may not work in the Indian context. So one, there is a need for that. The second is the media literacy, where we need to sensitize the media that the crisp health articles that you talked about also needs to be produced with a lot of responsibility. What I have seen in my personal experience of being in media for the last 15, 16 years is there's always a rush to produce articles, even health articles, that will get you more viewership. And what happens in a way is you tend to have clickbaity articles, you tend to focus on a particular topic that you know will get you more viewership. You will tend to not go deep into researching or something that Dr. Jaya said. I mean, it's not in the very basics of journalism that you talk to the source before you drafting an article. People won't talk to a doctor before writing a health article. They will just churn out an article, submit it, and it gets clubbed into various categories. It gets clubbed into, lifestyle. It gets clubbed into do-it-yourself. It gets clubbed into home remedies. And we do fact check many of those. I do get a lot of calls from my ex-media colleagues who are not happy about me fact checking those articles. But we believe those have a lot of health repercussion. You do a quick search about, I mean, some of them are outrightly stupid and funny. You do a quick search on the health benefits of Bindi. you will find the top media houses have churned out 1,000-word articles, given 10 points that the Bindi can solve, including depression. And not a single quote from any of the doctor. We have so many doctors on our panel today, which is a very good thing, which shows that the fraternity is ready to engage with media. Media is just not taking the advantage of that. So that's a very unfortunate thing that we need to solve.
Anandita, I'd really like to add a couple of things to what both Dr. Sudeep and Dr. Deshmani said. And that is, the readiness of medical professionals to engage with the media. I mean, it's unprecedented. We've seen that after this pandemic. We're seeing doctors on television that we'd never heard of before. And we're also learning to follow their lingo much better, the way they nuance their statements, the way they temper their, it's not blind advice that they're giving, but they're trying to educate the audiences to understand that science is full of uncertainties, the evidence is layered and it is emerging. So when science is evolving, you need to be patient and you need to wait for the outcomes of a clinical trial, and those may not be the final answers to something. So I think, as I said before, cultivating a scientific temper is really key, but you need that demand and pressure to come from audiences as well. If the media audience continues to swallow the bilge that tells you by rubbing a certain oil you can burn your fat away, then there's no pressure on journalism. There's no pressure on people to sort of upgrade our own standards of quality, right? You have a discerning audience, it will breed better journalism. You have better journalism that explains things and asks questions, you get better media audiences. So I think this is an osmotic process that needs to be encouraged at every level possible, both from the scientific community and the community of media, because we do share an epistemic responsibility when it comes to educating the public about health.
Anita, just add just one point is, we are very happy to engage with reporters and things, but very often we find that reporters have a discussion with us and it's misquoted without informing us. So you very often don't get to see the copy before they publish. And that's a very distressing aspect, which really somewhere requires to get corrected.
Right, absolutely. A huge shout out to Dr. Geeta, who has been an expert that we have taken reference to for the cancer chapter as well. She quotes that misinformation can be sensational if one chooses to spread it that way. With social media, it is allowed to spread unrestricted. That can ingrain in the less educated or empowered easily, and this unsolicited information may become a refer to charter. The media, unfortunately, also latches on to sensational stuff quite unabashedly. So thank you, Dr. Geeta, for that. We have a couple of questions from the audience, very important questions, I believe. We have a question from Sachi about fact-checking myths are more for the digitally illiterate. What about the prevalent misinformation at the grassroots level? Apart from burdening the ASHA workers, what could be the other ways for behavioral change communication?
I'm just going to take a couple of lines, a quick shot at that question. And this is something that I wanted to raise earlier on. In countries like India, where you still have varying levels of literacy across the population, there's an enormous respect for the written word, a great reverence for the medical community, and a great trust in what you see on paper, what you hear on television, still. And this kind of trust, I think, should not be bartered away, in this by pandering to the whims and fancies of conspiracy theorists or propagandists of all kinds. The thing is, there's the other interesting aspect to countries like India, which is that there is quite the cultural divide between the English language media and the local language media. And there's an enormous kind of influence that the local language journalists wield among their audiences because they culturally resonate with the beliefs, with the the local happenings, and the color, the texture, the feel, the smell of the communication is so different from what you see in English. And I think that enormous potential of the local language to influence health behaviors among people, particularly in the tier 3, 2, and the 4 towns, that is yet to be sort of tapped and leveraged for the benefit of public health. And for that, we need to start, having doctors who can be very comfortable and clear communicating good health guidance in the local languages. That's key. Good, trustworthy sources who can do that. We need to train journalists in health communication in the local languages. That's very key. And we need a lot of fact-checking help with the local languages as well. I think by arming local language journalists with these practical tools, and above all by building confidence in them, that they can do as well as an English language journalist, because they are experts as far as their audiences are concerned. What myths and misconceptions prevail among the audiences that they report for, they are the experts there. So it's just a matter of mastering the science, and that can be done with patience and with a lot of help and cooperation from the scientists, researchers, and the medical practitioners.
Yeah, I have another interesting, is anyone else going to pick up that question, or can I move on to the next one?
No, I just wanted a quick comment that, I so agree with what Dr. Jaya just said. And I think we do have a network of, family practitioners, which are very often not utilized. And from the ICS, the Indian Cancer Society, we recently have started a movement where we want to try and get more and more family practitioners involved in cancer care. For example, simple things like patients don't have to come all the way into cities for treatment. Whatever things can be done locally and sorted out at that level. But this can also be a great source for getting rid of misinformation if there's somehow this whole group of people which is available in the periphery, in small towns, are taught about misinformation on different aspects. For example, if you want to just take menstrual irregularities, things like that, speak on certain of 3 or 4 topics and train them. And even you could take the help of organization like Rotary, which is all there down at the district level. They all are looking for good projects to take up. So this may be a very, very good avenue.
I'll just make a quick point here. Thing is, the question is very valid, that a lot of Indian audience is not on digital media yet. And how do we actually reach out to them and tell them that this is fact, this is myth, or this is misinformation? So a few tools that we have used is local print media, which is still a very powerful medium in the rural areas, the community radio that I already mentioned, and also the responsibility lies on us fact checkers to find out the misinformation that is spreading there. Yes, ASHA workers can be a mode of taking ahead the communication, but at the end of the day, it needs to be fact-checked by the fact-checkers or by the doctors, and irrespective of whichever location they are seated at, or whether they are digital or non-digital. So the mode of communication can be print, can be community radio stations, and also through local level trainings. However, one point that I would like to mention, and this is a problem that we have faced, is we tried doing a couple of experiments at the village level using local doctors. What we found out is many of the local doctors themselves are not trained. And I say this with a lot of respect. I mean, nothing against the fraternity per se, but then a lot of, I'll give you one example. A very senior doctor who probably had 35 years of experience got into a fight with us when we tried telling him that salt water is not a remedy for COVID-19. 35 years of experience, I know salt water is virucidal. What do you know? That's a problem that we have faced. So what we decided on is we will work with a certain, a community of doctors that we choose, and then we will use various mediums to push the message through.
Thank you for those insightful comments, three panelists. But unfortunately, we are running short of time. It so happens that whenever you're right in between an interesting, insightful conversation, we'll always have to wrap it up. But yeah, so is the case again today. So audience, thank you. We have taken note of your questions. We will write to the panel experts and we'll probably send you back the responses if that is okay. And thank you, panel. It was a very insightful, very, very important discussion that I'm glad has happened today and because of the report. If you have any closing remarks, please feel free to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Nandita, and congratulations on a fabulous report and for highlighting this particular problem.
Thank you, Dr. Deshmani.
Thanks, Nandita.
Congratulations, I think.
Dr. Jaya, please go on.
No, please.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Nandita, I already kind of made it clear on mail, on Twitter, and I say it again. I really loved the report. I really loved the work that you guys have done. A bit jealous too, because I wish we could have done this. But then, honestly speaking, absolutely loved your work because working in this domain, I know how important this work is. Thanks to Meta, Facebook, Trushar for supporting this because this means a lot. This gives a lot of encouragement to us also and a lot of belief that we are doing the right thing or the good work. And also thanks to all the panelists and doctors who have involved in this report or otherwise also, because this couldn't be done by fact checkers or media people alone. This needs to be done together.
Right, thank you. Dr. Jaya?
So, thanks for making me a part of this discussion. I learned a lot from the wisdom of all the participants and our wonderful keynote speaker. And Nandita, it's a fabulous report. I just got it, so I barely had an opportunity to review it fully, but it's packed with wisdom. And I think a good part of this may be used, but I think it's well worth distributing this to journalists on a large scale. So make sure to put a copy in our library. And here's to more such reports and lots more conversations that will help promote a better understanding of science, particularly to do with health guidance among our populations. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, all the panelists again. It was a great discussion. Over to you, Parvati.
That was a stimulating discussion, and I'm sure the audience agrees with me that you have given us all something to think about vis-a-vis the linkages between the medical community, the media, and the people, and how each of us is a stakeholder in this conversation. So once again, thank you so much for that, Dr. Jayalakshmi, Mr. Sengupta, and Dr. Deshmani. And also, once again, thank you to Dr. Subbarao and Dr. Geeta, who have helped us time and again with both the report and the podcast, and now by coming here and sharing your comments with us. So thank you so much. And now I would like to invite my colleague, Mr. Rakesh Dubburu, to propose the vote of thanks. Rakesh Dubburu is the founder of Factly, a well-known public information initiative. That's us. Factly has won numerous awards under Rakesh's leadership. He is also a well-known transparency campaigner in India and has been working on issues related to the right to information, or RTI, for the last 16 years. Over to you, Rakesh.
Yeah, thanks, Parvati. Thanks for, I would like to start by thanking Trushar, who have supported us through the fellowship for the last 12 months or so. I would also like to thank Professor Gagandeep for giving us that wonderful keynote and starting off this evening's discussion. And to all the panel speakers, Dr. Jayalakshmi, Mr. Sudipta, Dr. Vinay Deshmani, all of you have added, great value to the panel discussion, and on an occasion like this where we thought we should kickstart this conversation about misinformation around health. I'd also like to thank all the experts who are on your screen now, who have helped us through the report, through their insights to difficult questions that we had and others had, and I'm sure all of you will learn a great deal from the insights of these experts which are in the report. So I would also like to thank my colleague Nandita, who joined us as Health Fellow 12 months ago, and was put in immense efforts in bringing out this report. So Nandita, big congratulations to you on the launch of this report. And Parvati, who's with us, so she has edited, proofread the entire report. So big thanks to her and our design team for putting together the entire report, and the entire team at Factly and all the participants today have been, very patient and asked pertinent questions. So before I end it, so the report is available for download, and you can read it. You can download it from health.academy.in. The link is given here. Nandita, can you paste the link again? Yeah, the link is here. So we would like you to go through the report. Please share your feedback. So we believe this is not the end. This is in fact the beginning. So we'll have many more conversations. People will pick up from this report and do a lot of research. So we don't intend to say that this is a very comprehensive thing and everything ends here. But we believe this is a starting point, and more people, like Sudipta was saying, will take it up and ensure that we all contribute to reduction in health misinformation. Thank you one and all for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, yes. So we've come to the end now. So yes, as my colleagues have said in their opening and concluding remarks, we at Factly have brought out the Health Misinformation Report in partnership with Meta in the hope that it serves as a starting point for the much needed conversation on the dissemination of all information related to health. We hope that the report and today's keynote address and panel discussion have been a step in that direction for each of you who has attended this event. The full report is now available online. We've provided the URL in the chat box, so do take some time out to read it and share your feedback with us. So thank you all so much once again for being part of the launch of the Health Misinformation Report, and thank you for staying through the whole event. I'm sure you've all taken back a lot of wisdom from this discussion as well. And with that, I leave you. Good night.